Welcome everybody to the SESHA Webinar series. We have, as you can see on your screen, we have next month's webinar is on December 13th, and its title is The Business Value of Integrating Health and Safety. And so make sure to join us for that one. And with, as with all of our webinars, this one today included the recordings. It's a full video recording of the webinars are available on the SESHA web page at seshaonline.org, and then you just choose webinars right up there at the top. You have to be a member to see those, but joining is easy and currently free, so good value. This one is being recorded, as I said, and we are joining today's webinar, which is titled TMAH Toxicity and Controls Update. Our presenters are Brad Brooks, Brooke Vermos, Ernie Timlin, Richard Melville, and Tom Diamond. We'll be answering questions at the end of the webinar, but please feel free to submit your questions throughout the webinar, and you can do that by entering them in the questions box on your GoToWebinar panel. If you're looking for continuing education credits for this webinar or any of our webinars, you now will receive an automated email the day after the webinar indicating that you joined the webinar, how long the webinar was, and that it was available for continuing education credits. So with that, I'm going to turn the webinar over to Brad, who's going to be our first presenter. Thanks.
Well, welcome to all. On behalf of my colleagues and co-authors, I would like to tell you that we are absolutely delighted to be here with you and share with you a little bit of what we know about tetramethyl ammonium hydroxide. The reason for this and the purpose of us being with you today and discussing this today has to do with the fact that there's a growing number of semiconductor processes, applications, and other operations that use TMAH at high concentrations, and more are being proposed, some even at elevated temperatures. Certainly vendors, formulators, other semiconductor companies may not be in fact aware of TMAH's high acute toxicity, particularly its systemic toxicity. And what we hope to do today is share with you the results of toxicity testing in animals, some of which was sponsored by IBM, on the effects of repetitive dermal contact and potential underlying mechanisms of toxicity. Also present some additional information on acute systemic toxicity in humans and animals as well. And finally, finish up with safety precautions and controls that were implemented by IBM to minimize the potential risk, and also have been implemented at other places as well. Just a little background on tetramethyl ammonium hydroxide. It's a quaternary ammonium compound, the cation. Strong base with similar strength to sodium hydroxide. Methyl groups clearly provide the organic character for this. Highly water soluble, essentially non-volatile, and it boils to a solid state. Generation of trimethylamine usually occurs in that boiling. It's a strong odorant and gives good warning. Inhalation may occur with exposures, however, to aerosol or mist. There's a high acute systemic toxicity based on both oral and dermal LD50s in animals, and you can see those figures there. It's certainly corrosive to skin and the respiratory tract. Solutions typically have a pH greater than 13. Also, we see some aquatic toxicity with this compound as well. Why in the world did IBM get involved? Well, first of all, we make things. Initial use were in photoresist and photolithography within IBM. Small quantities of TMAH were used in those operations, but it became the prime candidate to replace tetrachloroethylene in the screen cleaning operation associated with the ceramic packaging process. That would entail significant increases in the use volume, significant changes in production handling, and significant tool changes as well. While there was a long history of use within the microelectronics industry, safety was assumed, but not much toxicology focus had been applied to back that assumption. You will find during the course of this presentation to you that this really is a collaboration between industrial hygiene and toxicity. Our industrial hygiene colleagues alerted us to the change that might occur. We did the dive into the literature at that point. That's a good practice we always use between industrial hygiene and tox here. And that is, if big changes are happening, we discuss it and usually dig deeper. In this deep dive we did before driving those changes, one of the key observations for the literature, and I won't talk about the company that did this study, it wasn't IBM, but it was an in vivo guinea pig study that implied systemic toxicity from dermal exposures to TMAH powder. And from that, there was an estimated LD50 of 25 milligrams per kilogram in guinea pigs, but the way the experiment was done was very curious. Dry TMAH powder was placed on the skin, and I can't imagine what dose was inferred really, but that caused enough concern on our part to initiate a series of studies. These were repetitive dosing studies in rats sponsored by our company, IBM. The design of the initial study was essentially a dose range finding. Rats were dermally exposed to TMAH concentrations in water, and you can see the concentrations there. They were applied to the shaved skin of rats in what is called a hilltop chamber. I've got a little cartoon to the right there that shows you what they look like. There was a constant dosing of 1 milligram per kilogram, and you can see the doses that result from that. Well, strikingly, all of the rats treated at the 1 milligram per kilogram dose at 12 and 25% TMAH died within 3 hours of treatment. Some, in fact, died before they could be placed back in their cages. Signs of toxicity included lethargy, convulsions, tremor, and death. One rat in the 5% group died after the first exposure. Others died within 2 weeks. No rats in the lower dose groups died, but severe erythema, edema, and necrosis at the application site was observed in the higher dose groups. Well, it seemed to us that we needed to do a repeat on that using lower doses. And so we set up another study, including 10 males and female rats, and this time exposed to 0, 0.25, 0.55, 1, 3, and 5% TMAH. It was delivered in hilltop chambers again, 6 hours a day, 5 days a week for 4 weeks. In this case, we attempted to use a 5% sodium hydroxide positive control, but that was terminated by day 3 simply because of the level of skin corrosion that developed on that control. The results of this series, 9 of 10 male and female rats in the 5% group died within 3 days. 8 of 10 male and female rats exposed to 3% TMAH died by day 14. Interesting to note that no deaths in the 1% or below TMAH groups. The threshold for dermal irritation with repetitive exposures in this series was 0.55%. We also decided to look at another series of studies related to how long could you be exposed, how long could the rats be exposed to a high dose of TMAH, and that setup involved 5 groups of 3 male and 3 female rats. The way this went was they were exposed to 25% TMAH for 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, 1 hour, or 2 hours. At the end of the exposure duration, the rats were washed and cleaned with distilled water. Results of this series of studies, clinical signs prior to death included tremors, ptosis, hypoactivity, ataxia, coma, dyspnea, and convulsion. It was interesting that we did not see deaths with the 15-minute exposure. We certainly began to see deaths at 30 minutes, and all male and female rats in the 1 hour and 2 hour groups died. Again, severe irritation present at the application site. We also decided to look at the potential effects on nerve transmission in rats. We thought that might be part of the story here. So 9 male and 9 female rats were exposed to TMAH at 25% for 3 hours and divided into 3 subgroups. The first group was exposed and not watched. Second group was exposed, and acetylcholinesterase levels in red blood cells and plasma were measured in that group. The third group was administered atropine. That's an agent that blocks the acetylcholinesterase receptor, and that was delivered 30 minutes prior to TMAH, 10 milligrams per kilogram. The results from the nerve transmission study were interesting, not entirely surprising, but interesting. Clinical signs of toxicity included tremor, ptosis, hypoactivity, ataxia, coma, irregular breathing, and convulsions. All rats died within 2 hours. Interesting, no indication of change in the acetylcholinesterase activity, and atrophy did not affect the symptomology or the survival of the rats. We also began to look at the effect of TMAH exposures on blood gases. And in this study design, 6 female and 6 male rats were exposed to 0 or 5% TMAH. Measures were taken hourly at 1 to 4 hours, arterial blood measures. 8 female and 8 male rats were exposed to TMAH, 25%. And again, measurements taken at 1 to 4 hours. The results from this series showed a significant decrease in blood pH, acidosis, and an increase in the partial pressure of CO2 in males and females exposed at the 25% TMAH level. Decreased carbonate in males treated with the 25%. That would be a logical finding in acidosis. Decrease in partial pressure of oxygen only in males and females treated with 5% TMAH. Not really sure how to explain that. And then finally, changes indicative of a disturbance in acid-base balance really was the main finding here. Let's talk a little bit now mechanism of action. Tetramethylammonium hydroxide completely dissociates from the body, forming tetramethylammonium ion, and that ion is rapidly has been shown to be rapidly absorbed in rats after an oral exposure. Most of the absorbed dose is excreted and changed via the urinary tract. The hazards of TMAH are caused actually by both the tetramethylammonium cation and the hydroxyl ion. Screening information data sets from the OECD notes that tetramethylammonium salts, such as the chloride salt, that also fully dissociate in water are considered surrogates for tetramethylammonium toxicity. Of course, those toxicity values for TMAC are converted to TMAH concentrations using the molecular weights of both TMAH and TMAC. Mechanism of action is rather interesting here. The tetramethylammonium ion is recognized as a cholinergic agonist that can bind to nicotinic and muscarinic receptors in several locations, in the ganglion cells, the skeletal muscles, the smooth muscles, and the cardiac muscles. Anthony et al. In 1989 reviewed the oral intoxication and pharmacotoxicology of TMA and concluded that the TMA ion can induce transmission blockade on ganglions and long-lasting depolarization blockade in the neuromuscular junctions. Also, the paralysis of respiratory muscles or ganglion nerve blockade, or both, have been proposed as the cause of death following TMA intoxication. Other studies that have come along since ours are interesting. This is sort of an eye chart, and I apologize for that. I won't read this to you. One of the interesting things about Wu et al. In 2012 is that they proposed that the chemical burns that are caused by the hydroxide ion in the toxicity of dermal exposure to the tetramethyl ion in the rat model, in fact, are necessary for the TMA ion to cause the significant systemic toxicity. And their study showed that. Again, I won't bother you by reading this long slide. It's interesting that it's likely that the hydroxide ion may be the reason for the rapid uptake of tetramethylammonium hydroxide through the skin and making a systemic appearance. One of the interesting findings from this, again, a study in a rat model, recommended that the tetramethylammonium hydroxide should be neutralized as rapidly as possible in the event of exposure, and prompt respiratory support is required to prevent respiratory failure and death. Those are really important findings for us together on the phone today, in that first aid for humans, really important finding, and you'll see later in Dr. Tavermos's part of this presentation why. So the final animal study that I would like to bring to your attention is, again, Wu et al., a different study that he performed. The really important part of this study showed, well, first of all, they looked at our work and they cited it in this study, but they allowed that the TMA poisoning resulted in respiratory acidosis. That's what we found as well, and hypoxemia. But the main thing here is that mechanical ventilation, particularly preventive mechanical ventilation, prevented the rats from dying. Like us, they found that atropine pretreatment did not prevent death, but they found that it prolonged the survival time. The key here is that they concluded that the respiratory failure was responsible for deaths, and therefore they recommend that first aid should emphasize respiratory support. So some interesting findings from animal models. So now I'd like to hand off to my colleague, Dr. Brooke Tavermos, who will then take you through some human case histories and fatalities. Brooke?
Uh-oh. Brooke, are you able to hear us? Okay. Let's see. Brad, is there someone else who can start to walk through this piece, or do we have I don't have a text number for Brooke to ping her.
Okay, sure. I'll begin to walk you through these. Oh, here we go. Brooke is asking you. She just hit me with a same time. How do you unmute on this webinar. That's what she would like. And Brett, if you could let her know that, I would appreciate it.
Yep. Hi, Brooke. So you should be able to unmute. The problem might be that you've muted your phone, but if you've joined via your computer, you can unmute using your GoToWebinar control panel, and there'll be a little microphone, and you can click on that to unmute. Otherwise, you may have muted your phone, which it depends on what kind of phone you have. I see she's popping up there. Brooke, why don't you communicate with me through the chat function on the GoToWebinar panel, and Brad, you can fill in for a minute until she's ready. If that's okay.
Awesome. Thanks. That's great. So this same investigator, Wu, back in 2008, looked at a case history in which a 22-year-old male was sprayed with 25% TMAH. 29% of the body surface area was affected. Unfortunate person immediately closed the valve and showered, immediately, not being timed necessarily well, but he showed second and third degree burns on the skin. The symptoms included 15 minutes after exposure, general weakness and salivation. 30 minutes after exposure, loss of consciousness.
Brett,
great.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
I'm so sorry.
No problem. No problem. So I'm down on the first slide. I'm covering the symptoms. So please.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah. Perfect. Thanks so much. So. Yeah, so in this case, it's really interesting because despite immediately rinsing off in the nearby emergency shower, within 15 minutes of exposure, the man started to develop symptoms of, general weakness and increased salivation. He lost consciousness 30 minutes after exposure, and then within an hour of exposure, the worker lost all vital signs. And so he ultimately passed away within 8 days despite receiving mechanical ventilation treatment at the hospital. And then the authors had hypothesized that since tetramethylammonium is recognized as a cholinergic agonist that can bind to both the nicotinic and muscarinic receptors in smooth muscles and cardiac muscles that Brad was pointing out, that the rapid loss of vital signs within the first hour of exposure may have been due to inhibition of the cardiac system and paralysis of the respiratory muscles. Okay, next slide, please.
Okay.
So a second case of severe TMAH toxicity was also reported in 2008, and this case involved a 33-year-old male that was sprayed with 2.38% TMAH. And the worker, he reportedly suffered first and second degree burns over 28% of his body. And similarly to the prior case report, despite immediately rinsing off following the exposure, the worker still developed signs of general weakness and labored breathing within 10 minutes of exposure. This worker did survive, but he was started on mechanical ventilation within 2 hours of exposure, and then he had to actually remain on it for just over a day. But overall, this case suggests that, again, TMAH is rapidly absorbed through the skin, even as a dilute solution, and that solutions as low as 2% can have the potential to be fatal if enough body surface area is affected by the exposure. Okay, next slide, please.
Okay.
So in 2010, Lin et al., they reviewed all the TMAH exposures that had been reported to the Taiwan Poison Control Center between 1986 and 2009. And they identified 13 cases of TMAH exposure. And of those 13 cases, 4 workers had been exposed to 25% TMAH. And of those 4 individuals, 3 of them died. And in those cases, the exposed body surface area ranged from 7% to 29%. And the elapsed time from exposure to decontamination was reported to be less than 1 minute in some of the cases. So again, really emphasizes how quickly TMAH is absorbed through the skin and how quickly systemic toxicity can be observed. So the individual exposed to 25% TMAH that survived was exposed only over 3% of his body. And then 9 workers were identified that were exposed to solutions of about 2% TMAH. And of those 9 reports, only 1 victim developed the life-threatening manifestations, which were, they're very similar to those associated with the fatal cases following exposure to 25% TMAH, but this individual survived with the assistance of mechanical ventilation. And the key differentiator in the degree of toxicity observed following exposure to 2% TMAH was the percent body surface area affected by the exposure. So the worker with the highest percent body surface area affected, which was 28%, that worker was the one that developed the most severe symptoms, which were life-threatening. And then the other individuals exposed to 2% TMAH, they suffered exposures just over 1% to 18% of their body surface area and ended up requiring only mild supportive care. But these cases illustrate 2 things. One being that the percent TMAH in solution is an important factor associated with the degree of toxicity experienced by an individual. And then the second is that the percent body surface area also appears to be an important factor dictating the level of response. Okay, next slide, please. So the most recent case report was documented by Park et al. In 2013, and this involved a 39-year-old male who spilled 8.75% TMAH over 12% of his body. And so after the spill, the worker finished his work while wearing the contaminated clothing, and he had liquid, of course, on his hands and feet and legs. And then about 25 minutes after the exposure, he finally went to the shower room to rinse off, where he was subsequently found dead after about an hour. He didn't actually make it into the shower to rinse off. Okay, next slide. So just in summary, when you look at these case reports together, they really indicate that the concentration of TMAH is a very important factor, obviously, in determining the degree of toxicity exhibited by an individual following dermal exposure. And that solutions as dilute as 2% may be potentially fatal depending on the percent body surface area affected. And thus, that's also an important factor, as well as the duration of exposure when considering the toxicity of more dilute solutions of TMAH. But the differences documented in skin contact and the potential differences in the effectiveness of personal protective equipment and clothes makes a direct comparison between case reports difficult. But the thing to point out here is that the clinical features of TMAH were largely labored breathing, decreased heart rate, decreased cardiac output, skin rashes, acidosis, general muscle weakness, and respiratory failure in the most severe cases. And as Brad noted, many of these effects have also been reported in animals following dermal exposure. But most importantly, the case reports demonstrate how quickly TMAH can be absorbed through the skin and how quickly adverse effects can be seen, in just a matter of minutes. So the key is really to prevent exposure. And with that, I will turn it over to Rich, who will discuss some important safety actions that can be taken to help prevent exposure.
Rich, you there?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So one of the first things that we had to do when we learned of the severity of the hazards associated with concentrated TMAH that we had not encountered before was update our MSDSs for the IBM formulations containing TMAH. We also had to notify the US EPA under Section 8E of the Toxic Substance Control Act. This particular section deals with reporting previously unknown health effects associated with a chemical or actual case reports associated with a chemical. And in this particular case, it was new information we had regarding the toxicity of TMAH that we had to report. We also did permeation testing of gloves and coveralls to make sure that we had good chemical resistance for the materials that we were using. Generally, we've found that TMAH we basically have pretty good permeation breakthrough characteristics for nitrile gloves and also a glove called Trionic, as well as some disposable coveralls like Tychem. We also shared the summary of the IBM sponsored TMAH study results with the American Chemistry Council, as well as the Semiconductor Industry Association. And there was a cooperative effort with suppliers to identify technically feasible alternatives, which is something I'm going to get into a little bit in the next slide. So one of the things that we do fairly commonly is process hazard reviews. These are required, well, I'll deal specifically with TMAH. When we're dealing with TMAH, if we're dealing with anything containing more than 1% TMAH, with the exception of photoresist developers with the typical concentration of 2.38% TMAH, we institute we perform what is known in our companies as a process hazard review, where we look at all the aspects of the process and all of the points of potential exposure to see and ensure that we mitigate any kind of exposure by enhancing controls and or that's not feasible completely, to make sure we have the right personal protective equipment prescribed for the employees working there. In addition, and this is a very important aspect of our program, we have executive sponsored risk acceptances and sign off for any of these chemicals. So when I say these chemicals, I'm talking specifically in this case about chemicals containing 1% or greater of TMAH, or with the exception of photoresist developers. Okay, I lost the slide there for a second. Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, and sometimes we're dealing with, just to be clear, we're dealing with TMAH at elevated concentrations, high temperatures. So oftentimes, usually the response of the executive that we've dealt with in the past has been, okay, let's reconvene in 6 months. I want to know what you're doing to get out of using this chemical or this chemical at this concentration or at this temperature. So they put that challenge directly to the engineering team, and where feasible, we look for less hazardous alternatives to TMAH, or at least lower concentrations and temperatures. And next, please. This is an example of chemical label that's commonly used, presently used in IBM, and where for all intents and purposes, similar information is conveyed in the company I'm working for now, Global Foundries. You can see that we have hazard symbols. It's also important to note that, like, for example, in this particular case, you have a chemical name, but you don't have TMAH identified in the name. Signal word of danger. We have fatality warnings for all chemicals that contain greater than 1% TMAH. And the label has to identify TMAH, as you see in the bottom. This is because all employees at our facility that work with TMAH are required to receive TMAH training. And if they don't know that they're working with TMAH, that could be a problem. So obviously, by including TMAH, the fact that it contains TMAH in the label, we know that their training will be triggered. and they will take appropriate precautions. Next. Okay, with that, I'll pass it on to Ernie Timlin, who's going to talk about some specific engineering and administrative controls that we've put in place. Ernie?
Okay, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about exposure controls, and then when I'm done, we can get to some questions. It looks like we'll have time for that too. So try to move through this as rapidly as possible, so we can hear some good questions and hopefully good answers. So, the theme of what we were trying to do with exposure controls is minimize the manual handling of TMAH, and some examples were by using bulk TMAH delivery with double contained distribution systems where feasible. We also put engineering controls on as I mentioned, chemical delivery, process equipment as well, and waste treatment systems, and those typically included process enclosures, splash guards, so folks wouldn't be splashed, interlocks that stop the chemical delivery when one opened a door, for example, or any other typical kind of system breach or opening, double containments with liquid leak detection, for example, in the inner annular space between an inner tubing that contains TMAH and the outer one that was used to contain any leaks of it. We had remotely activated equipment compartment cleanup showers, which we designed and added along with conductivity confirmation and some tools, and I'll show you some photos of that in a minute. Local exhaust, of course, and some specific environmental type controls for TMAH. So next slide. So this is an example of a tool that was used in a high concentration of TMAH, and we specifically asked the manufacturer to add a couple of things which are shown here next to those green arrows. So one example was a double wall gasketed interlock process enclosures, and that went from single wall to double. And also another example is a remotely activated equipment cleanup showers with conductivity confirmation. And what that all means is these were TMAH containing areas, and if a leak occurred, the liquid would end up in a drain where we had inserted a conductivity probe so that we could see if the conductivity changed, that we indeed had chemistry in there and not just water. And then we could use the cleanup showers to actually clean up the mess, so to speak. So if you go to the next slide. So in the larger, the close-up photo, you can see where the connectivity probe connected to the actual unit, the connectivity unit at that point where the upper green arrow is. So that was the connection that went down to the probe that was actually in the drain. And the shower activation switches, where the other green arrow is, are switches that one could operate from outside the compartment. So therefore, no one in maintenance or any other group had to go inside the compartment and potentially be exposed. And we would know whether there was going to be an exposure potential before they went in by hooking up the conductivity meter. So, a good example of an engineering control that we designed that hadn't been offered in the past, so that we could keep our people out. And the showers, for example, just had a little plastic shower head, very cheap, with one of those switches, as you can see, those valves that you can see on that left green arrow, and really cheap to install. So good way to save lives cheaply. Next slide. So here's an example of a TMAH tow. I think probably a 230 or 40, maybe even 300-gallon tow, which had some automated handling For example, you can see there's a tubing in the above the yellow tote in that left photo, and you can also see it underneath the plastic in the right-hand photo. And so that's a double-walled setup there. And we, you know, we had been using that, and then when we started to see some of the potential issues, or you know, the TMAH 25% and et cetera cases of people, and you know, in rat studies, we said, you know, we've got people going up on this platform and then doing some work next to the system, and if the overhead happened to let loose, we might actually get you know, a certain amount of TMAH doused over someone's head. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see what we did to remove that possibility. So what we started to do in the later stages, after we realized you know, the hazard that was presented by TMAH, particularly 25%, which is what we were you know, what we were receiving in those totes. If you look at that, the next to the bottom, actually the arrow that's right in the middle of the page, that's the one just above the one on the floor there. You'll see, if you look at that, you kind of can see that there's a yellow tote inside of that enclosure. So this tote enclosure completely encloses it, so people can stand up on that ladder there, or that ladder platform, and they can reach in. You can't quite tell from this photo, but those are gloves that are built in, and they can actually do the hookup to the tote once it's inside the cabinet without being exposed at all. So that was a later version of a tote connection system that we used after we started reading the literature and learning about TMAH 25% in particular's potency. Next slide. So these I call them R2D2s, are an example of something we bought specifically once we learned more about the hazard to put on top of 25% and in lower concentration as well, drums of TMAH, 55-gallon drums. So 55-gallon drum will fit right under that, and as you can see, there are gloves built in so that you minimize the potential for exposure, because there's also a gasket around the bottom of that the half circle, or that enclosure, I should say. You can see, actually, I think you can see in the left-hand photo, there's a black line right under the white rib of that particular unit. And so that thing would sit down there with a little pressure on top of the drum, so you'd have a pretty good seal there, and you could work to make your connections while the cover is in place and gloves are in place, so no opportunities for exposure. Next slide. So we also had administrative controls, such as I think Rich mentioned some regarding training for folks in TMAH safety and et cetera. We worked on improving safe work practices, doing more process hazard reviews. We did things to help remind people to not walk into spills, because we had times we would have people walking through liquid on the floor thinking it was just water, and there's always a possibility that it wasn't water, it's something else. So we lost the actual slides here. So
really?
Okay. I've got a computer that has the slides on it. So,
oh, it's not the TV, it's your computer.
So we also improved chemical labels, as I think Rich mentioned, SDSs. We stored TMAH totes and drums at floor level, and we'll see a photo of that in a later slide. And we required PPE in a very specific to TMAH written PPE hazard assessment. So how do I move this to the next? Oh, next slide. Okay, this is an example of TMAH storage where we looked at where it was being stored in our warehouse in these, let's say, 250 to 300 gallon totes. And we found that some of them were actually up on upper levels where a fork truck operator, when they, and if you ever operate a fork truck, you know that when you lift something up from an upper deck, let's say, an upper level, you end up having to tilt it back in order to move with it and bring it down to a lower level, and that, you know, where you can move it off to the truck or wherever it's going. And when you do that, there's a potential with these totes that any liquid that may have leaked out of the cap that's on the top, and they do leak, we have seen them leak, that leak could actually come down on the head, for example, or the, you know, legs of the operator of the forklift. So we forced all these to be stored at ground level, so there wasn't any opportunity for fork truck operators to get splashed from overhead. And next slide. So these are just some various examples of what we would require in terms of all the various operations on the left-hand side, and in the middle and to the right, you can see the various types of PPE that we specified. Depending on the type of operation, it was either more or less. Typically, Solvex and Trionic gloves we found through permeation testing were both great for TMAH. Next slide. Okay, with that, any questions for any of us?
Okay, yes, we do have a few questions. Folks are typing them in now, and I'll welcome more people to do so. Type the questions into the question section on your GoToWebinar control panel. Before I go to those, I'm going to take one more moment to plug SESHA. Please do take a moment to look at the SESHA webpage, seshaonline.org, and note on there all the activities that are going on at the regional level. You can submit abstracts for the 2018 annual meeting in Scottsdale, and keep an eye out for future webinars. All right, with that, I'm going to jump into the questions. The first one we have is from Wayman Aldridge. It says, any cases of skin exposure to chemicals containing TMAH as a lesser component? For example, AZ300 contains 4% TMAH along with NMP and propylene glycol.
Yeah, this is Brad. We don't have any experience with the fact that it's a 4% level would be cause for concern to me. I'd say anything above 1% across the authors' organizations, be it Global Foundries, IBM, or SUNY Polytechnic Institute, I think any above 1% would be a concern for us, and we would likely implement significant engineering, administrative, and PPE controls.
Excellent. We have people are really taking advantage of asking questions, so we have a bunch for you guys. Next one is from Ron Schultz. It says, any special requirements for waste disposal? Any concerns about personnel that could contact downstream?
Ernie, you guys want to handle that?
Actually, I think I might ask Rich if he has any comment on that.
Okay.
So I personally don't have a lot of experience with this, but the same requirements apply in terms of training, and I have seen containers labeled as TMAH waste. So our environmental folks have the awareness of the hazards of TMAH and also the requirements for handling it. So we would treat it similar to the way we would a virgin chemical in terms of safety controls.
Okay. We had a question from a couple of people about whether the slides would be available. So there is a video of this. There will be a video of this posted within a day or two. And it would be up to you guys, Brad and Brooke and Ernie and Richard and Tom. If you're willing to share the slides, we'd convert them to a PDF and we'd post it with the presentation. So you guys can decide that, and then the rest of you can go and look there in another day or two. The next question is from Aaron Zudi. It says, is wet scrubber appropriate for TMAH exhaust or something else?
A wet scrubber is sufficient for TMAH exhaust.
Okay. The next one is from Sharon Schindel. It says, what are your thoughts on TMAH analog materials? Do you have similar controls in place?
Are you talking maybe a little clarification would be helpful, like things such as tetramethyl carbonate, tetraethyl ammonium hydroxide, things of that nature?
Yeah, so Sharon will have to type in whether that's accurate or not. We can move on to the next one and then circle back if she's able to give us clarification. So the next one is from Kenneth Kretschmann. It says, were the large surface area exposures that led to fatality due to lack of wearing protective equipment?
Yeah, so a lot of times they just had on normal clothes and whatnot. So, yeah.
Okay. Next question is from Stacy O'Connell. It says, what is the aquatic toxicity concern since this material is likely discharged to POTWS?
Well, it certainly, this is Brad. This is Brad. It certainly has been shown to induce aquatic toxicity, significant aquatic toxicity in Cerodaphne species, Daphnia species. So there's evidence for that, and therefore treatment and dilution probably would be very important here.
Okay. The next question is from David Hazen, and it says, is exposure to eyes also considered a potential fatality?
Yes, from a toxicity standpoint, the eyes can actually be a very effective route of exposure with regard to systemic toxicity. So absolutely, notwithstanding the fact that tetramethylammonium hydroxide in the eyes is likely to be incredibly corrosive to the eyes as well.
If I could just chime in, it's a general practice of ours, if anyone's working with liquid chemicals for eye protection, at a minimum, they would be wearing safety goggles, not even safety glasses, but goggles.
Okay. The next question is from Francis Rudy. It says, have studies been conducted, or has there been a correlation to exposure to TMAH in the solid form?
The only solid form data that I'm aware of is that study that I mentioned that was a trigger for us to look further. And that was by a company that had submitted some data to a governmental agency using powdered TMAH exposed on the shaped belly of guinea pigs that they then reported an LD50 for it. And that's what triggered most of our studies, that finding. So at least one crude study, very crude study that I'm aware of, showed powdered TMAH as inducing systemic toxicity in guinea pigs.
Okay. We have a follow-up from Wayman Aldridge about the exposure to skin. So it says, with regard to the human exposure incidents, was contact made with unprotected skin, or did it occur through clothing? Brooke said normal clothes, so does that mean not direct skin contact?
I think so there was, I think, a combination of both. There was direct skin contact, and then, it just went right through the clothes, because oftentimes, like the first case report that I talked about with the 2008 report where he was sprayed with 25% TMAH. He was, checking piping, and so it like sprayed all over him like a shower, and then, just so there was obviously skin that was not protected by clothing, and then it also, went through the clothing too. I mean, just I think like any fabric that gets saturated, right? It'll go through the fabric.
Okay. The next question is from Aaron Zudi. It says, on bulk delivery enclosure, does opening the door depressurize the delivery lines?
Ernie, I think that's yours.
So, Aaron, I think what you're talking about is a double-walled line. Is that?
Yeah, Aaron will have to type in clarification.
Yeah, so if we're opening a door to a cabinet that has a double-walled line in it, I would say generally no.
Okay.
Okay, sorry, Eddie.
Richard.
The only thing I was add is we're looking at a new piece of equipment right now. One of the things we always try and do, where possible, is to have the lines negatively pressurized. So in other words, drawn towards a pump, so that when you're you're not dealing with high pressure. That's not always feasible, but that's something to look at in your equipment design and reviews.
Okay, and Michelle Smith has a comment. Says a recommendation for best practice installation would be to ensure that you're using a suction process to remove the chemical from the container rather than pressurize the product from the TMAH supply container.
Yes, that was exactly my point, as a matter of fact.
Yep, I thought that would be a timely one to make.
So that's a good catch.
This next one is from Jacob Schock. It says, understanding the significant dermal exposure risk, any further studies on inhalation exposure? We've evaluated using TMA as a surrogate.
Yeah, for the most part, the only way you'd have a respiratory exposure would be mist and aerosolization of this. The vapor pressure of this is such that it by itself wouldn't come into the air. However, the more heated it becomes, there's again more concern. I'm not aware of any studies at this point that have looked at that due to the fact that it has a vapor pressure that in most cases would not cause it to be airborne.
Okay, our next question is from Ben Hertzler. It says, one of the presenters mentioned nitrile and trionic gloves. Did you say that these materials are appropriate for handling TMAH or not?
Are.
Yes, are.
It was an easy answer, quick answer. This is Kuishong Se, and the question is, are the studies on the environmental toxicity to fish? Are there studies on the environmental toxicity of fish?
I would assume there are, but I'm not aware of any specifically.
Okay.
Brett, if I could just jump back to the previous question on the Trionic and Solvex gloves, just one thing to keep in mind for people. You always need to work within the parameters of the breakthrough times, which are available to those companies' literature. In addition, you need to take into consideration the fact that if a chemical is in contact with the glove, and even if the glove is good for greater than 8 hours in terms of a breakthrough time, that chemical continue to permeate the glove and render it risky to use. So it's very important. One of the things we do with maintenance people in particular, and anyone handling TMAH, things that may have TMAH residues on them, is we treat those as disposables. So be wary of reusing them, because if there's any kind of residue on the glove, it can continue to break through even when you're not handling the chemical.
Excellent. So earlier, Sharon Schindel had asked about the controls for TMAH analog materials, and we had asked her for clarification. And so she said, yes, for example, 2-hydroxyethyl-trimethylammonium hydroxide, also known as choline hydroxide, as an example, and a few others. So that's what she was referring to.
So I don't have any experience working with that particular chemical or those particular chemicals. We have worked with chemicals that are chemically related to TMAH. In each case, the first thing we do is we engage, obviously looking at the material on the SDS, the information available, but we always engage with Brad's team to see what we can learn about the material. Sometimes the chemicals may not have, and again, I'm maybe more in Brad's area of expertise here, but the chemicals may not have the same magnitude of toxicity as TMAH, but that doesn't mean that they're not very toxic. So you can't be kind of inured to the fact that you're not working with TMAH and therefore it's safe. You have to treat each one on a case-by-case basis. We work with toxicology, and then depending on what information Brad and Brooke can give us, we move forward with, if necessary, process hazard reviews and executive risk acceptance and sign off. And of course, go ahead, I'm sorry.
I was just going to back up what you said, Rich. This is Brad. We have explored tetraethyl ammonium hydroxide, and while it has, let's say, slightly lesser systemic toxicity, the systemic toxicity associated with it is still significant. I would say any of the analogs to this should be viewed with, let's say, proactive suspicion and handled carefully until proven otherwise.
Okay, our next question is from Aaron Zudi. It says, what was the temperature of the TMAH in the case studies?
Most of the operations were just at room temperature. I mean, I don't think they were heating the TMAH or anything like that. Certainly the one in 2013 was just a jug at room temperature that they opened it up and spilled it on him. So yeah, I'd say most of them were probably at room temperature.
Yeah, that's my recollection too, Brooke.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, mine too.
Aaron snuck in a few questions, so here's his next one. What is recommended? What is recommended protocol for skin exposure? Water flush or water with some type of neutralization solution?
Well, based on what we're seeing, neutralization and flush together would be a really good idea. Based on just the data that we've seen in the rat studies, as well as the data we see in the human studies. Particularly that study that looked at the hydroxide ion, as being one of the main reasons that it goes systemic. So I would say as fast as possible, both neutralize and wash. The quicker the better. And even after that, the sooner you get them to an emergency room, the better. One of the things that we've worked on, both inside IBM and with our two partners here today, is a package to send with someone who may be going to the emergency room. Most emergency room physicians are going to look at tetramethylammonium hydroxide just on its face as a caustic base, and likely they'll want to treat the dermal lesions that arise from that, not knowing that you probably got a full-blown systemic respiratory issue coming at you, and that you should probably start not only neutralizing but mechanical ventilation as soon as possible.
Okay. Aaron did have one more, and then we've got a couple others and we'll be done. But Aaron's his other one is, was there follow-up on exposure to humans that did not die, i.e. for long-term effects?
Well, the half-life of TMA is actually pretty short. It's only like an hour. So, and these were just acute exposures. So, I mean, I wouldn't anticipate, I mean, besides like obviously like the severe burns that could obviously be scarring, but I don't think they had like, I wouldn't anticipate them having like respiratory problems for the rest of their lives following the acute exposure. But repeat exposure could be a different story.
Okay, the next question is from Afsi Jarami, and it says, is the door interlocked to the supply line?
Rich, do you have an answer for that one?
Sorry, I was on mute there. For the equipment that we showed, Ernie, I'm not sure. I know that this new one that we're working on, I believe that is the case.
Okay. The next question is from David Hazen. It says, is there a definitive concentration of TMAH that would not be considered potentially fatal, a potential fatality if exposed to skin? I heard less than 1% at one point during the conversation.
That's where we are parked. I think the three organizations that were co-authors on this are parked at less than 1%, but we still treat it with caution.
Excellent. We have one.
Yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
I would just add to that too, like for the, depending on the surface area affected by the exposure
Yes.
too, right? So maybe you have a really dilute solution, but if it like drenches the whole body somehow, I would still be concerned about it.
Okay. We have one statement and one more question, and the statement is from Ron Schultz, who's always the first person to ask questions on all of our webinars, and his statement is, gee, Aaron Zudi gets to ask all the questions. And then we have one question left, and it's from Aaron Zudi. It's recommended neutralization solution, question mark.
That's a good question. I think anything that would neutralize the high pH would be recommended, but also such that it wouldn't further damage the skin. At this point, I haven't seen anyone, and I'm trying to make everything we talk about, something I can refer you to with a citable source. I'm just not aware of any current emergency medicine discussions or citations that would talk about a recommended thermal application here as far as neutralizing this.
Okay. We did get one more question snuck in here. So this one's from also from Kwisong Se, and it says, I think the remote activated shower head sounds like a good idea. Being conductivity activated makes sense for false activation, question mark?
The conductivity doesn't activate the shower. The person reads the meter and then determines whether they want to flip the switch, and they can do all of that from outside the cabinet.
Okay. Sorry, we did get one more question snuck in under the wire. This will be the last one. This is from Afsi Jarami. It says, usually neutralization is not recommended on live tissue. Curious to know why it is recommended here.
It's recommended simply because of the hydroxyl ion and its activity, and the hydroxide ion here is really thought to be required, if you will, to induce this rapid absorption. So yes, I'm aware of that, and that's why I didn't recommend anything, but like I say, neutralization based on these studies seems to be one of the things that could help. in reality, I haven't seen any publications at present, like you are referring to, that are recommending a neutralization solution here.
Excellent. So I know that we ended up with well over 100 people attending this, and obviously several of them were very attentive and had questions, and this was a really successful webinar. And so I want to on behalf of SESHA, I want to thank you, Brad Brooks, Brooke Vermos, Ernie Timlin, Richard Melville, and Tom Diamond for a really excellent webinar. Thank you again. And with that, we'll wrap it up.
Okay, thanks for all the questions, guys. This was was made fun for the co-authors due to the questions. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks.